Have you ever wondered if you were a good dive buddy? Or maybe you were going on a dive and in the last minute your dive buddy canceled on you, so you ended up having to go on a dive with someone that's completely new? Hi, I'm Jose. The dive master said I could dive with you. Is that okay? Well, I guess so. In this video, we're going to learn everything that you need to know about diving the buddy system, especially if it's someone new that you've never been diving with before. This is going to be fun. Before we begin, let's talk about what buddy diving is. Diving with a buddy is usually done with two people. That's the ideal situation. And the idea behind buddy diving is that you're there to help your buddy and your buddy is there to help you. Now, if an emergency were to arise, that's where it's critical for you to have a dive buddy, because that way you can help each other make your way through that situation and you'll be able to get back to the dive boat or to shore safely together. Diving with a dive buddy isn't just about safety, it's also about having fun. It's a lot more enjoyable when you have someone underwater with you to be able to point cool things out. And also, heaven forbid, if you get lost underwater, it's two minds instead of one to help you get back to the dive boat or get back to shore and help each other with navigating. Also, buddy team should usually be two people, but from time to time, you might get that odd person out. So if you have a third person, it could be a buddy team of three. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's never more than 3 dive buddies. Once you get to 4, we split it up again, and then it's 2 dive buddies diving together. So a big part of diving the buddy system is understanding who it is that you're going to be diving with. And that's kind of why we poked a little fun in the beginning of what it's like to dive with someone that's new, because you essentially know nothing about that person. So the one thing that I want you to get out of these videos is that you need to understand who it is you're diving with and get to know about their background, what kind of training they have, what kind of diving experience they have, and really get to know all this stuff and not take it for granted. So if you get onto a dive boat and at the very beginning you're getting to know somebody, that's the first question. Hey, what's your training certification? What level do you have? When was the last time you went on a dive? How much experience do you have? These are all things you want to get a feel for, because it's going to let you know how you're going to end up diving the dive, because it's not the same for me, for example, as an instructor to go diving with another instructor as it is if I'm diving with somebody who just got certified 2 weeks ago and they're on their dive number 7 or 8. So that's something that I want to know before I get into the water with someone that's new. Something else that you want to find out is what is their objective for the dive. So if I'm diving a wreck, for example, are they going to want to swim around the wreck only? Are they going down there to shoot video? Are they maybe doing photography? Do they want to do swim throughs? So what exactly do they want to do throughout the dive? This is something you want to find out while you're still on land before you get in. Obviously I said a wreck dive, but this is the same if you're doing a beach dive, a reef dive, you get the idea. Before we move on, if you could do us a favor and click the like button, hit the subscribe and the bell notification, it'll really help us out. It helps with the YouTube algorithm and helps our video be seen by more divers like you. Once you've gotten to know your dive buddy, the next thing you want to do is turn your attention towards their dive gear. Because for all you know, they might be using something drastically different than what you're used to. And the first thing that you want to do is take a look at how they're going to share air underwater. So first of all, we have a completely different video on how to share air. We'll link it under the description, but real quickly, there's many different ways of sharing air and you want to find out how this person does so. So do they have their alternate air source on a necklace? Are they using an octopus? Maybe they're set up on an air tube. They're all different ways of sharing air. You just want to know how they would do it in case somebody were to run out of air underwater, how you'd be sharing air underwater. Also, you want to find out what size tank are they using. Are they using a tank that's larger or smaller than yours? This is also important information. Did they show up with nitrox? Maybe you're diving air and they're diving nitrox. This is something you need to find out before you get in the water. Also, what are their gauges? Are they using metric? Are they using imperial? This is going to be critically important when you're asking underwater how much pressure is left. Next, you want to find out what kind of inflator they're using on their BCD. Different manufacturers create inflators differently, so if you were to need to inflate and deflate their BCD, where are the buttons to do that? Also, you want to find out how much weight they're using and where they're locating their ballast. So are they using a weight belt? Is it a right hand release the way it's supposed to be? Do they have ditchable weights? If they do, how do they ditch those weights? These are all really important things. You also want to find out if they're using a dive computer. And not only if they're using a dive computer, but is that dive computer liberal or conservative? Now here, it's really going to depend on whether or not the person you're diving with is experienced. But I know people that dive really liberal dive computers and they're very conservative with it. And there's people who dive computers that have a conservative algorithm and they wait till there's only 1 or 2 minutes left before deco, and that's when they start doing their ascent. And this is going to make a difference once you get inside the water. The last thing that you want to find out is if they carry a DSMB with them. And this is also a good time to find out if they feel comfortable shooting a DSMB from depth. So on some dives, you might be required to shoot a DSMB. On other dives, you want to have it just in case you need to use it. But in either case, this is the good time to figure out who's going to be the better person to be shooting that DSMB. Once you're done with getting to know the dive buddy and getting to know their gear configuration, it's time to start planning the dive. Now, this is a good time to mention that dive teams should usually be 2 people, but it can sometimes be 3 if there's an odd person out. And let me explain the reason why. If you have 2 people, then one person's responsible for the other one's responsible for the first person, and it's really easy. As long as you're both keeping each other in sight, you're both responsible for each other. The second that you introduce a third person, each person is now responsible for 2 people. So you can see how it's a lot more difficult to keep track of 2 people than it is 1. And it also adds to it the likelihood that somebody's going to become separated from the buddy team. So 3 is always going to be the maximum. And it's just out of necessity because you don't dive alone. And there's times when you have an odd number, so you end up having to have a buddy team of 3. But if we get to a point where we have 4, there's no reason to have 4 people buddied together. At this point, you have 2 buddy teams of 2, and each person's only responsible for 1 person. Now that you have the buddy team established, the next thing that you want to do is you want to figure out what you're going to be doing on the dive. Now, I mentioned this earlier. It's worth mentioning again because this is critically important. You want to be on the same page as far as what you're doing throughout the dive. So if this is a dive that you're going to be shooting video, that's what you're doing. If you're taking pictures, that's what you're doing. If you're going to just sightsee, that's the thing that you're doing. If you're diving on a wreck, this is the time that you want us to talk about if you're going to do swim throughs, if you're not going to be doing swim throughs. You get the idea. The point is that you both want to know what it is that you're going to be doing throughout the dive, so there's no surprises once you get inside the water. With the objective already established, the next thing that you want to figure out is who's going to be the dive leader. Now, this is a good time to do this because you've already had the conversation about who has what level of certification, how much experience you have. You've also probably gotten a good taste or a good sense of what kind of diver they are based on the gear that they're diving with. So decide who's going to be the dive leader throughout the dive. And then this is also a good time to try to figure out what the dive is going to look like as far as air consumption. You want to talk to your dive buddy and figure out if they're good with air. Are they somebody who usually is the last person back on the boat? Or do they run through their tank really quickly and end up having to call the dive because they're running short on air? It's a good time just to touch up on this subject. Next, you want to find out how you're going to communicate underwater. Now, we have a separate video that goes through the essential hand signals, but at a bare minimum, you want to know, of course, how to say okay, what you're going to do if you're out of air, how to ask for air pressure, how you're going to say the numbers for the air pressure, but you want to get the essentials down. I'm not going to go into all the different hand signals, but how are you going to communicate once you get underneath the water? Another thing that you want to discuss is this hand signal right here, which is when to turn the dive. Now, you want to find out when your dive buddy is used to turning the dive. Different people turn their dives at different points. What's important here is that the two of you agree on what the criteria will be and when it is that you're going to turn the dive. And once you get through that, now you're going to figure out how you're going to be doing your ascent. So what I mean by this is sometimes on deeper dives, some people do deep stops, some people don't. Some people, when they get through their safety stop, they like to extend that safety stop a little longer. Some people don't. All of this stuff, you want to discuss it and know what it is that your dive buddy is going to be doing and what you want to be doing when you go on the dive before you get in the water. Now you've gotten to the dive site. If you're on a dive boat or if you're going off of the beach, you're ready to go diving. It's time to do the buddy check. Now, there's a whole lot of different ways of doing the buddy check. There's an entire alphabet soup. Each agency seems to have a different way of teaching this. I'm going to teach it the way that I do as a NAUI instructor, and that's by using the acronym S.E.A.B.A.G. Now, I'm going to go through each letter and explain what it means. The S stands for site. So you're going to be obviously diving a particular site. What's the depth of the site? What's the topography of? What's it like underneath the water once you get down there? Next comes emergencies. We were talking about this earlier, but how are you going to handle an out of air situation? What are you going to do if you get lost? You're going to walk through all the different emergencies that are likely to happen and how you and your buddy would handle this. Next is activities. We talked about this also. What's the objective of the dive? How are you going to be conducting the dive? Who's going to be the dive leader? Next comes the bag part of S.E.A.B.A.G. And for this, I'm going to need Carlos. So Carlos, can you please come in?
Hi, guys.
All right, and if you could turn around for me. So the B stands for buoyancy. So what I'm going to be doing here is checking everything that affects Carlos's buoyancy or whoever your dive buddy is. So first I'm going to check his inflator. Does it inflate? Does it deflate? And obviously he can do it for himself or she can do it for herself. But the point here is that you want to check all these different items out. Also, if there's any dumps on the BCD, I happen to use the same rig, so I know it's right here. It's working. You want to make sure the dump valves are working. If the person's using a weight belt, do they have it on? Is it on proper? Is it a right hand release? If they're using ditchable weights, are the ditchable weights in place? Can they easily release them? You want to make sure everything that affects buoyancy is on and ready to go for the dive. Then comes the A. The A stands for air. So here I'm going to make sure that his tank is fully turned on, which it is. And if you could turn around for me, Carlos. And here what we're going to do also is we're going to check that both of his second stages are working properly. So if you could breathe from each one. And if you could also take a look at your pressure gauge and breathe from your regulator. This is something a lot of people do, but you want to make sure that as you're breathing, that the regulator, the valve on the pressure gauge isn't moving, because if it is moving, it might be an indicator that the tank isn't fully turned on, which you should have checked, but it's a nice little check to do as well. So you've done buoyancy, you've done air. Next comes the G, which is for gear. And here you're just going to look to make sure that everything is in place, the clips are where they should be, nothing is dangling, and the G also stands for go. So if everything is ready to go, it's time to go diving. Now that you're done with the buddy check, it's time to do the dive. And you've probably heard the expression, you plan your dive and you dive your plan. So it's time to dive the plan. Now there's a few things that I should mention here that make you into a good dive buddy and that you should follow during the dive. First of which is to maintain the correct distance. So throughout the dive, you want to have a distance where you have line of sight between you and your dive buddy. Now, depending on the visibility, this distance may change. If I'm in the Caribbean in crystal clear water, I can allow a little more distance. If I'm in murky waters, I need to have a little less distance. But the point is that if you need to render aid to your dive buddy, that you see that the issue arising and you're able to render the aid when it's necessary. The other thing that's really important, and this is something that gets overlooked all the time, is that you want to match the speed of the slowest diver. Different divers dive at different speeds. Whoever is the slower diver throughout the dive, that's the person that should be controlling the pace throughout the dive itself. And also, you want to be communicating throughout the dive. So how much time is left on the dive computer? How much gas do you have throughout the dive? When you notice it's time to turn the dive, you want to make sure that you're communicating that as you're getting close to that turn. And then obviously when the time comes from the turn, whether it's you that calls it or your dive buddy, you're going to call the turn itself. Something else that's really important throughout the dive is that you're looking at your dive buddy and you're trying to see if there's anything that could be off. So if there's bubbles coming from the dive gear, if a strap becomes loose, if something falls out of a pocket, if an octal becomes unclipped, I've seen this way too many times and it's just dangling around in the water. All these things are things that you should point to your buddy's attention and fix it while you're still underwater. Finally, when it's time to ascend, you want to make sure that you follow the plan that you guys agreed upon for how you're going to conduct the ascent. If you're doing any deep stops, if you're doing extended safety stops, these are all things that you're going to follow on your ascent. Once the dive is over, it's time to help your dive buddy with the post-dive procedures. Now, this includes helping your buddy break their gear down, and it also helps for the two of you to get together and do the dive logs in case there's something that one of you missed. This is also a good time to see if you can help each other with some coaching. So maybe your dive buddy's new and they're using their hands underwater, which you know you shouldn't be doing when you're scuba diving, or maybe they're flutter kicking when they should be frog kicking. Maybe you notice that they seem to be slightly overweighted. These are all things that you can help each other with at this time. Finally, don't forget, if you guys are taking pictures or videos, this is a good time to share your contact information so you can get those pictures, you can get those videos, and you can share stories with the other divers that were on the dive boat or the dive site that you were diving on. By the way, if you got to the end of the video and you're also a diver, then you're probably going to want to download our free guide, The 4 Keys to Mastering Your Diving. It's over here on your right, and we're also going to put a link to it in the bottom of the description. This is a guide where we go into 4 simple things that you can do to be more comfortable, more efficient, and just a better diver overall the next time that you go diving. So you're definitely going to want to check that out.